Welcome to the first session of Disassembling the Trust Machine, an introduction to a political economy of blockchain. Description. This seminar carefully disassembles the components of the Bitcoin proof-of-work algorithm in order for the students to get a first glimpse of the technical, economic, and political concepts, techniques, assumptions, and ethics that are mobilized in order to make the protocol work. The seminar introduces the core aspects of blockchain and cryptoeconomics from a radical interdisciplinary angle, and so is an essential introduction for both newbies as well as those who are already working in the fields of or familiar with blockchain, cryptocurrencies, and cryptoeconomics. Jaya Clara Bragg writes, speaks and does research on power in distributed systems. She spends her time between Durham University Geography Department, where she's writing a PhD, in London, where she spends much of her time in the InfoSec research group at UCL Computer Sciences Department, and Werner as collaborator of Riot Institute for Future Crypto Economics. I will now hand the mic to Jaya.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. So I thought, well, I'll give maybe a little bit of a fuller introduction to myself and my work, and also the reason why I wrote this seminar series and is putting this, and the reasons why I'm putting this forward as a project. Yeah, and then after that, I thought we'd do a quick round of those of you who are here, just so we get an idea of who's in the room, so to speak, and what your kind of interests are in the field, and maybe also just a little bit of kind of your level of knowledge of blockchain, cryptocurrency, this space so far. Like it says in the introduction, my kind of way of dealing with the field is a little bit different from what you might kind of experience elsewhere. So hopefully, like, it doesn't really matter the diversity of levels of knowledge in the field so far. So yeah, as Patrick mentioned, I'm finishing off a PhD at Durham University. It's in the geography department. The tentative title is 3 Strategies for Thinking Blockchain Politically. I also do work with the computer sciences department, the InfoSec group there at UCL. I'm not affiliated with any commercial project in the blockchain space, which gives me some freedom to deal with these topics from interesting angles. But I do work.
Somebody muted Jaya. Please refrain from muting.
If you don't like what I'm saying, speak.
Chris,
Where's Chris Hopper?
Here's Chris. Please refrain from muting the. If you want to be muted, I can mute you. Please, class. I'll do the muting in this setting.
Yeah, but so just to finish, kind of giving a little bit of kind of background to who I also work with a group called B9 Lab. They do training for blockchain developers, and this project called RIAT in Vienna, which is a research institute for future crypto economics, based on research again, and kind of cultural practices rather than selling any particular product or anything. Do you hear me okay, Chris? No. I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. Patrick, do you hear me okay? Yeah? All right. Right, good. In this first session, I thought, well, first off, okay, I don't normally give seminars online, so I'm going to try and do a kind of bit of a slide thing. And I think maybe at the end of the session, we can have a bit of a kind of chat about whether that works or not, because maybe slides online, maybe it works better if you can actually see my face. But otherwise, in this session, what I'd like to cover is some basics of what is cryptoeconomics, the need for political cryptoeconomics, why I'm kind of putting this forward, and it will also cover a bit the kind of technical details, let's say, before we move on to some of the deeper conceptual stuff in the next sessions. Did everyone get the readings, and have people had the chance to look over the readings?
Yeah.
Yes, fantastic. So hopefully that was will also help for this first introduction. But before I start on that, maybe we can do a quick round in the room and see who's here. Natalie, would you like to start?
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm based in London at the moment. Can you hear me? Yes. I work at a gallery here, and I'm interested in blockchain, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, because I know very little about it, relatively speaking. I read about art here and there, and some artists that I'm interested in have expressed interest themselves in these economic functions. So this is why I'm here. And I enjoyed your text, Jaya. I really like to read it.
Great. Heather, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I didn't get the reading, but anyway, hopefully I just joined the class late. But my name is Heather. My day job is working at a technology company. I work at Kickstarter doing community outreach. But before that, for the past sort of decade plus, I've been working in the fields of like net art, post-internet art, and digital art as a curator, most recently as a director of an organization called Rhizome. And yeah, just like over the years, part of that has been thinking about technologies that can broadly like enable decentralization, like the internet and mesh networks and free software. And yeah, I've been at the periphery of like blockchain communities, mostly like, I guess, like mining communities. And yeah, I'm interested in Jaya's take specifically. I'm just, yeah, interested in hearing your perspective.
David, do you want to go next? Oh, we can't hear you. Nope. Maybe take your headphones off.
David, if you have a problem with your microphone, you can write it in the chat and you'll ask Chris. And after we are done with all of people, which means when you come to Alan, I will just reiterate what you've written. I think that's the best way to do it. Otherwise, we will have to wait until you manage to get your audio working.
Cool. So we'll move on to Chris in the meantime.
Yes.
Hi, Chris.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, hear you now. Great.
Yeah.
Nice,
Great. Okay. I had just plugged in my external mic. Sorry. Yeah, I'm David. I'm one of the moderators of Trader. There's a Reddit group, and then there's also a Telegram. So I help moderate that group. I'm affiliated with the Economic Space Agency. I don't know if you've heard of them before. I think they've been out for a while. I was living in Oakland for a couple months last year before they moved out to where'd they go? Berlin.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, they didn't quite get their ICO on, and that's what I was going to do, their Telegram stuff. But they still have a group. And then I met someone at the MIT Legal Forum named Daza Greenwood, and ended up doing a teaching assistant for the first course in computational law and blockchain at MIT in January, just like a couple-day class.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a project called Sanctioned, which is for ferreting out fraud and abuse on Telegram and sort of doing like a surveillance thing. So great to be here.
Mm-hmm.
Chris? Can you? Okay, then I think it's best if you just write a short introduction of yourself in the group chat, and I will reiterate that. And I will now ask Jara.
Hello, hi. My name is Chiara, and I'm currently based in Amsterdam.
Hello.
Hi.
Christopher.
I studied economics and
I'm
finance,
having a
and
lot of difficulty with audio at this
hello.
point, so please bear with me.
I
Chris,
hear.
Chris, let's do it like this. Let her finish, and then I'll take you on.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, thank you for offering me a scholarship to attend this. So that's really nice. Like I said, I graduated in economics and finance, and I briefly worked in investment banking and management consulting, but I've heard that was boring and not stimulating, and there are more interesting things to do. One of them being political economics. I've always been very interested in that, and I believe that the classic theories are no longer able to describe what's going on, and I believe that reading political economics with blockchain is a key. It's probably a way to get a more accurate theory. So I'm very interested in where this seminar is going.
Cool.
Okay. I will jump back to Chris because seemingly your audio problem was temporary and we could hear you. Could you unmute your microphone, please? Chris? I think there's problem persists in a way. Okay, then I'll ask Brian if please present to us. Brian.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I have been taking classes periodically with the New Center for the past, since it began. And I also studied philosophy at school. And I now trade cryptocurrencies a lot. I do that for work, and I advise people on it and educate them on that. So just on the trading aspect, but I'm also very interested in the theory behind it, as are most people, and as most people should be. Consensus is really fascinating to me. I think that it is kind of like consensus is like probably the best onto-epistemological theory or practical use of an onto-epistemological framework. So that's the angle that I look at it through. So, yeah.
Cool.
Bruce. We can't hear you. You have to unmute us and yourself. There's a mute microphone.
There, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yes.
Great. I'm a grad student at Portland State University in the geography department. I'm doing my thesis on economic geography of smart contracts. Originally wanted to do my thesis on blockchain, Bitcoin, and smart contracts, the economic geography of all that. And my advisors advised me to narrow my focus, which I'm starting to see was a really good idea. And that's where I'm at right now.
Alan, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Alan. I'm from Mexico City. I'm an architect, and I'm doing a master in critical theory. And I also just started as a certificate student here in the New Center. And well, I'm quite a beginner to blockchain and crypto economics. I have a couple of friends who are really enthusiastic about crypto economics, but I learned through them a bit about how blockchain works and the different cryptocurrencies, but they could never explain me the political aspects and the philosophical aspects of blockchain. So I found this seminar and I'm interested in learning about it.
Brilliant. Chris, want to have another go? Oop. Okay, maybe we just start. Yeah, Patrick? Cool. Right. So I'm going to switch over to this presentation. And let's see. And I will be talking at you for a little bit now. So the first thing, whoops, hang on. This is going by timing. Can you see the slides all right? Can you see what I'm doing all right here? Yeah, good. Nice one. All right, so disassembling the trust machine. So I thought I'd start with just explaining the title a little bit. So blockchain has also been called the trust machine. It has also been called the truth machine. And there is some very specific reasons for this that have kind of then bled out into a whole big imaginary around what this technology can do politically. So if we look at the concept of trust and we start tracing it back to what is actually meant by trust in blockchain technology, and we look at things like network engineering and the engineering of trustless systems, these are very, very specific things. So what you have when you have a fully decentralized network, the concept of a fully decentralized network is that you do not need to trust any particular node in the network in order for it to function as expected. Which also, there's another term that gets used in this context, which is authority, meaning there is no single authority. So the network does not depend on any single authority, but functions quite well with multiple authorities, preferably as, just preferably no authorities. But this is what's meant by trustless. You do not need to trust any of the other nodes in the network in order for it to function as you would expect it to function. So the reason why I start out with that is because this is the, let's say, trick number one to disassembling the trust machine, which is look at the specifics of where the terminology comes from, because then what we can start to see is how this idea of solving the problem of trust and solving the problem of authority in a decentralized network became extrapolated to solving the problem of trust and authority in society more generally, right? So, and the other aspect to that is that because a thing like a network and a thing like a system has a kind of abstract quality to it, that we can also use these words to describe most things in our lives, most things in our world, whether it's a political system, an economic system, an ecological system. Then we start to kind of like copy paste this idea of that. Okay, so we've solved the problem of trust, we solved the problem of authority. We have a consensus-based system, which means very, very specific things within network engineering, and then extrapolate those to a kind of broader social reality. The problem is then when we start looking closer at what really happens within our social, political, and economic context as we deploy these technologies, the reality looks quite different, right? Like nothing is ever fully solved, nothing is ever finally determined. Problems of power, authority, politics, and so on have not been kind of finally resolved through this magical machine, but it does reconfigure these things quite radically. So this is the project that I'm kind of putting forward. This is why I've invited you people to join this seminar, to a little bit kind of flesh out what is that space between, the kind of technical of having solved the kind of a technical problem, a very specific problem of authority and trust, and then that whole space in between where all kinds of, unpredictable things happen between the kind of design space, the protocol, and then like our social and political lives. So that's the kind of, let's just check if you're all still there, because I'm looking straight at the slides rather than seeing your faces. So that is the kind of intention here. So hopefully these are the questions that we'll answer today. What is cryptoeconomics? How are blockchain and consensus algorithms political? How are they economic? What is a political cryptoeconomics, and why do these technologies address the question of trust? So trust, I just spoke to you about that. the difference between trust and solving trust in a computer network and in social reality, and the kind of whole gray zone in between, where the concept in trustless systems is that you do not need to trust anybody. And I think that there's something here also about how when that security logic, which, you know, coming from, you know, the sentiment of designing peer-to-peer systems, makes a lot of sense and is politically hugely important, especially for protecting privacy and so on, and especially for marginalized groups as they interact with digital technologies. I think that as an imaginary, when it enters into a political space, might not be as helpful. What I mean by that is expanding the notion of trustlessness does not necessarily generate a culture of trust. It generates a culture of trustlessness, even though the applications supposedly are supposed to generate a culture of trust. But let's look a little bit closer at this trust machine, at its components. And I'm going to start off quite high level. I think the technical nitty-gritty partially is things that are quite well explained online. I think probably quite a few of you have you know, looked into different protocols already. If you've not, there are good explanations, but I will give a kind of high-level description, again, to open up some of these political entanglements. And so usually, you know, what happens is you've got kind of three, let's say, ingredients in the recipe of the various versions of the trust machine. And you'll see these also as kind of, let's say, three ingredients that get deployed over and over again in slightly different configurations, but for different applications that claim to solve one problem after the other. So like I was explaining in the introduction, this idea that, you know, what you'll often see in new blockchain applications is first there'll be an explanation for why a given problem is a problem of centralization, for why decentralization is a good thing, and then how cryptography and incentives are going to secure this new system that's being deployed. But it's a similar formula that gets rolled out over and over again, and to solve problems across the social, political, economic space, exactly because there is this extrapolation of these words, you know, the concepts of authority, the concept of consensus, the concept of, you know, and everything gets wrapped into a problem that's related to those particular words. And the technology has promised to solve it. So therefore, let's just roll it out. So let's look at these individual components a little bit. Decentralization, very similar to what I was explaining before around the concept of trust and trustlessness. A decentralized system is attractive because it's very resilient. You're not dependent on any single node. And decentralized, the development of decentralized technologies has a kind of long and very interesting history in peer-to-peer, and there's some very interesting kind of let's say political sentiments that come out of that. That let's say it's a political history or backstory to the blockchain space that is becoming more and more forgotten, and it is the backstory of attacking centralized systems on the internet, making those centralized systems impossible exactly because those centralized systems were turning into large-scale surveillance businesses, right? So, you know, the business models of, you know, your Googles, your Facebook, Amazon, this kind of stuff, you know, so this, you know, that kind of backstory, that history, I think is quite important to understand some of the reasons for why decentralization is attractive in this space. Since then, I think the word and the concept, again, has traveled. It's kind of shifted a little bit. It's got a bit kind of like fuzzy on the edges. There's not that much precision in the definition of the term. And it's become a little bit something that gets copy-pasted onto any kind of problem. But the issue is addressing in the beginning was pretty specific. Let's say, sorry, I forgot to turn my notes over. I'm just trying to see where I've got to. Yeah, so then cryptography. Cryptography secures the integrity of the data, so it ensures that nothing has been tampered with. I don't know if most of you managed to read through the kind of Charles Merkle classic text. And probably many of you are familiar with cryptographic keys already, and the concept of cryptographic hashing. But just to give a kind of basic introduction or basic overview, cryptographic hashing is this very interesting mathematical process where you take some data, you run it through a specific hashing algorithm, and it'll spit out a string of numbers. Only that data combined with that hashing algorithm will create that string of numbers. So if you change the data, it will change the output as well, meaning you can tell by running the data through the hashing algorithm again whether it's been tampered with or not. So it can, you can prove the integrity of data, but it has loads of other qualities that then you can build, cryptographic keys off of, and so on and so forth. And the Merkle text is a good introduction to show how, this basic mathematical phenomena, which is super fascinating when you start looking into it. This mathematical phenomena can really be used as a building block for lots of different things. So within our trust machine, what it's being used for is, yes, secure the integrity of the data, and let's say moderate access. So only those with the correct keys can go in and do a transaction or not. And it also organizes consensus. And so here, sometimes I give a kind of very basic explanation of proof of work. Should I do that? Or how do people feel? Because sometimes I do this just to get everyone on the same page or not, but maybe we just move on, yeah? Anyway, so I think one thing that is quite good to mention, just because, again, to get back to this thing of how concepts kind of bleed a little bit, we use the word consensus and consensus algorithms, and yes, what the consensus algorithm does is create consensus in a decentralized network around a given a given kind of data entry. But it's a very different type of consensus than you would find in, say, a political assembly, a meeting amongst people who are trying to come to an agreement about things. It's quite a different process with slightly different aims as well. And that's one reason why I do think it is quite good sometimes to kind of go back and look at these specific elements in the proof of work consensus algorithm. Because it is, I will explain it now. So, because it is literally a competition to run hashing functions, right? So, you've got the economic incentive in order to get people to run hashing functions to find a correct number. And so it's a lottery system for who gets to decide in the next round what should or should not be true. So when we talk about the truth machine or the trust machine and so on, it's that kind of process. It's a randomized process that makes it impossible for anyone to decide what the truth is going to be at every single turn. But it doesn't exactly look like deliberation. It doesn't exactly look like people coming together and discussing how the world looks and how we all kind of agree how the world works. It's an enforced mechanism that's taken out of the hands of the human in a sense, and that's partially the argument. That's partially the point. Is let's create a machine that is outside of the hands, outside of the control of humans, because individual humans are potentially corrupt, might get it wrong, and so on and so forth. There's an element of this kind of politics that's coming into it also. So let's create a mechanism that is fair, exactly because it does not care who you are. You get to have this turn, and then it will move on. Right, and then there's the incentives, the last ingredients, let's say, in our recipe, which in the case of the proof of work protocol are mining rewards. And incentives is another funny ingredient that in the blockchain space and in crypto economics is being used to moderate all kinds of behavior, and it's partially being used also to shift the discussion in a sense, because we're trying to create this machine that's outside of the control of potentially corrupt humans. We're trying to create this machine that is does not have any given political interests. The funny thing that incentives does is it makes it incentivizes so-called good behavior, it disincentivizes bad behavior, but it does not allow you to raise the question on a more fundamental level of what should be considered good or bad behavior. When we take the banal example, or not the banal, but the first example of the Bitcoin proof of work protocol, there might not be that much discussion. We don't want, there's like certain set of requirements that the architecture is supposed to fulfill, which includes things like double spending shouldn't be possible and so on and so forth. But when we get to other blockchain applications, you start to see the way in which this logic of using incentives to modify behavior in different ways start to be deployed in a very uncritical way, where the question of what is good or bad behavior in any given situation is not quite up for discussion, or it's been reconfigured as a purely technical question. And so this, I think, is like quite an important point to make also. On the flip side, and just so that you don't all think that I, dislike blockchain and I don't like the, proof of work protocols and so on. On the flip side, I would say there are, so the critiques of using financial incentives that you get from a lot of critical thinkers, people that don't like capitalism and so on, is that it reproduces this idea of the rational, self-interested economic agent that is only interested in their own personal profit, yeah? And that, to some extent is true if you conflate the model with reality. So first off, there should be a warning here across, the entire field to not conflate the model with the reality, because this is a big problem also in terms of how behaviors are understood in these systems. But the second thing is that the incentive dynamic in the proof of work protocol, what attracted a lot of people in the peer-to-peer community about that was the possibility of creating a system that could pay for itself. And this basic idea around, you have a community who's been building peer-to-peer networks and peer-to-peer projects for quite some time, looking to develop technologies that would help people who are otherwise facing censorship, that would help people be able to interact with these technologies in a safe and privacy-aware manner. A lot of these projects were also struggling economically, right? So here you also have a project that's looking to develop peer-to-peer technology in a direction where it's like, all of a sudden we've created an economy for our community, and we've created a system that not only serves the community on a technical level, but also economically. So this is just to say that I think it's unfair to think of the kind of incentives purely as some kind of reproduction of the same old capitalist logics. There were some other logics at play here too. Yes, so let's see, where have we got to? Generalized. So what I would like to talk about here a little bit is this what we've discussed just now is the Bitcoin, to a large extent, the Bitcoin protocol and the kind of general ingredients, let's say, of blockchain technologies. And Bitcoin was a project to create electronic money with no authority, a peer-to-peer electronic money, as we just discussed. And Bitcoin opened up a vast field of altcoin experimentation for a period of time, with lots of interesting projects coming up, because there was, all of a sudden you had programmable money, right? You had money where you could program all kinds of monetary and economic policies into the very protocol and play around with it with your community. Then a twist happened, and the Ethereum project was really the first to kind of articulate this broader shift that was starting to happen away from currency towards other potential applications of the proof of work consensus protocol. Now, this is all very familiar history to probably some of you. It's very well documented. But there's a couple of points that I think tend to be overlooked that are quite important about what happened in this shift of attention from the project of creating peer-to-peer electronic money towards using the proof of work protocol for any potential computation and any potential data and data verification. So the first one is that the political imagination was generalized too. And now I've already talked about this quite a lot today already, of how these concepts became generalized to a kind of political imaginary more broadly, of the possibility of replacing existing, let's say, human and institutional based authorities with a machinic network authority, let's say, outside of the control and outside of the influence of humans. So this political imaginary was generalized in the process too. And the second thing that happened that I haven't talked about yet was that instead of network computation, instead of these decentralized peer-to-peer networks being used as technologies to create money, all of a sudden, money became the technology to secure decentralized computation. So there was this kind of inversion, or in a sense, a little bit of both. And you see this if you look at what tokens mean in this space, right? And if you read mostly, kind of papers coming from developers and so on, you'll realize that the affinity here really is with the different forms of computation and computational systems that are made possible through the management of decentralization using some basic economic tools. So it's and I think it's interesting, and this is kind of let's say the basis of cryptoeconomics, really. So it's a very different way of thinking about economics, where it's let's say the computational concerns, the network security concerns are what comes first, and then the tokens are kind of embedded and used within that in order to facilitate these security models. And the first time I noticed this personally was when I was at a Bitcoin summer school in Corfu with mostly network security experts and mathematicians. And I come from a background in political economy partially, and I sat there and I was listening to them talk about economics, and it was just from a completely different perspective than what I was used to, and a completely different set of concerns. The other reason why I think this is interesting to highlight in a kind of political context is the fact that, again, you get critiques of this space as being kind of, I guess, a bit of a kind of hyper-capitalist kind of frontier in some sense, when actually I think that, again, is a bit of a misreading. There are definitely a lot of Austrian school economics and so on that are being kind of reused and reproduced in the space, but the affinity, the interest, and so on lies mostly with the computation. I think there's lots of space for political and economic experimentation that is not. I guess what I'm trying to say is the space is not very ideological when it comes to the specific kind of economic tools that are used, or the specific political ideologies that are being encoded. A lot of different things are being tested and tried in this space, and a lot more could be tested and tried, because unfortunately there is a bit of a fixation with Austrian school economics at the moment. But yeah, so number one, the generalization of the blockchain protocol from being a protocol to run decentralized money systems to a protocol to run all kinds of things implied also a generalized political imagination of the terminology being used and of the kind of project of solving the problem of authority through a technical system. And that started to be copy pasted onto any possible space. And number two, this implied also a shift from using network computers to facilitate money systems to using money systems to facilitate computer networks and the security models of computer networks. Cryptoeconomics. I mean, this is essentially cryptoeconomics. The definition that floats around a lot online is the following: that cryptoeconomics refers to the combination of cryptography, computer networks, and game theory, which provides secure systems exhibiting some set of economic dis or incentives. Yeah, so it's, you know, I think this definition says a lot in terms of where the concerns are at, that it's about the architecture. Economics is thought of a lot as either dis or incentives. You know, you lose money if you do something wrong, you gain money if you do something right. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the question of what is wrong or is right is kind of reconfigured as either a security question, technical question, or not really addressed that much at all, exactly because part of the point is to move, part of the point of a lot of this community, let's say, is to move away from political questions and reconfigure them as technical questions. And this is why I'm kind of raising this project of the political cryptoeconomics, is really to look at these two questions of what happens when you generalize a technical solution to problems of politics and authority, and you generalize that to a kind of social and political space that in fact looks much more messy and complex than any model does. And also, how does it actually reconfigure how politics operates, the modes of politics? How does it reconfigure questions of power, of what is possible and for who in a given space? Yeah, let's see. Yeah. And let me just have a look at my notes if there's anything I've forgotten. Yeah, I mean, this is basically the introduction, and hopefully it's satisfactory introduction to make the question of a political cryptoeconomics worthwhile and interesting for all of you to explore. Again, I know that there's some differences in the level of understanding of the protocols in this space, so for some of you this might have been a bit basic, but hopefully the angle in terms of the way that these protocols will be discussed in the next few weeks is new and interesting. To me, this is a very important space to look at now, because I do think this technology is changing a lot about how questions of power operate and are being addressed. So hopefully in this seminar we can kind of get at some interesting questions. In the so yeah, just to explain a little bit the readings for this week and why I wanted to start off with those. Obviously, there's the Bitcoin white paper. So, you know, the Bitcoin white paper, I think, is not just for the content, let's say, not just to understand the protocol, but I think as a kind of artifact in its own right, it's quite an interesting thing to look at, because I'm not sure what your experience was, but for me, let's see, wait, I'm just going to take the slides off so you can see my face again. Yeah. For me, when I read the white paper, it was, I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is a very kind of beautiful, very concise set of really interesting solutions to some quite complex problems. And I think there's something about how enticing the simplicity of these solutions are to why it then becomes such a powerful political imagination for how we can solve very complex things through these very beautiful models. So this, again, this conflation with between the model and reality, a very clean model and what is actually a quite messy reality when you actually roll technologies out that way, is something that I think is important to highlight. Merkel's text was much more like, you know, here's a good introduction to give you some idea of, again, some of the technical aspects of, you know, cryptography and public private keys, this kind of stuff, but also if you read the paper a bit as a lesson in the logic behind how these systems are being developed. So it'll give you also a bit of a sense of the kind of culture of kind of the InfoSec community and the way that they think about solving problems. And then hopefully my own essay, Disassembling the Trust Machine, is a bit of a kind of lighter read, a bit of a kind of introduction to how these things might be thought through in a slightly different way when we try and not just analyze the model and not just analyze the technical architecture, but analyze how the technical architecture actually interacts with the broader world. So yeah, I mean, how were the readings? How does this as a kind of project for the next 7 weeks, Sunday evenings, sound to you guys?
Hi, this is Bruce. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I enjoyed the readings, and of course I have a few questions, but I'll address those offline if that's all right. I have to leave early this week and next. I just wanted to give you a heads up on that.
Yeah.
And, all right, thanks.
Cool. And feel free to ask questions here too. I mean, I'm sure, you know, everyone will, others might be sitting with the same questions. And also I just want to say that, again, like it's an extremely interdisciplinary field and everyone has something to contribute here. So, you know, there's no question that's too basic. There might be questions that are too complex, in which case we'll all try and solve those together. But yeah, don't feel shy.
I guess there's one question I'd like to address real quick before I head out. In the paragraph where you talk about what matters here is that the decentralized network comes to an agreement about which one is valid. And it says, you say it does not matter which one it is, and that doesn't matter which one is more true or more fair.
Yeah.
Doesn't the timestamp determine that to a large degree?
Yeah, I mean, fairness in terms of turns is for sure determined by the protocol. But I meant more like in terms of kind of data that gets added more broadly, not just transaction data, but whatever else. Like the protocol itself is quite agnostic to the nature of that data. And the consensus protocol is to some extent also agnostic. I mean, if we look at the kind of smart contracts space too, that you have, you know, the fact that you have economic incentives to run things is exactly the kind of point of removing control to some extent from humans and say like, well, you know, so you'll have someone else in the network that will have an economic incentive to run that contract regardless of whether some other person in the network doesn't think it should happen, right?
Okay.
That's that's how it's kind of, the protocol itself doesn't care. Then of course, you know, there are the complications of, you know, that doesn't ever work quite that cleanly, right? And of course, human consensus and social consensus creeps in lots of different ways, and that's part of the point.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking in the Bitcoin space, but that, yeah, I get the Ethereum thing. Okay, thank you.
I mean, I guess also in the Bitcoin space, it's a little bit similar in the sense that like it doesn't care which, like it's part of the way that the system is censorship resilient in a sense, right? That it doesn't actually care what the transaction is, what it's for, who did it, you know. So it's agnostic in that sense, you know, which is also a good thing in some senses. But it gets complicated when you then extrapolate from there. So maybe I don't know if there's any other feedback on the readings, like whether this was an interesting set of readings to start off from, you know, what the and the difficulties, whether the level was good or not.
I'm interested, and I think your text, I addressed it quite a bit, but in perhaps mapping the history since Merkel of cryptoeconomics and political cryptoeconomics. And you were talking about sort of the decentralized system attacking, or sort of came out of a period of time in which somebody noticed that centralized systems like Google or Facebook were becoming systems of surveillance. So sort of what happened in between Merkel and I don't know, that period in time, and sort of, I mean, it would be cool to have a sort of timeline, you know.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And there is one text that I think is on the reading list, if not for next week, then maybe the week after. But that plots the timeline for decentralized systems, like the development of decentralized systems in general, which is very nice. Doesn't give maybe as much of a like historical narrative to it as, you know, that which would be a really nice thing too. If I find something, then I'll send it around for sure. But there's another element that, and I talked about this with some at a different conference recently. I might as well bring it in here because we're now in the discussion phase. But I think there's another element that's very interesting in how this space has developed in terms of approaches to decentralized systems and internet politics more broadly, which is this question of scarcity and abundance. That you had, you know, a lot of the peer-to-peer early peer-to-peer projects were, you know, closely related also to kind of piracy and hacker movements and so on, that understood the kind of digital space of the internet as a space of abundance, because you can have infinite copies, right? Like the fact that I have a piece of digital information doesn't mean that you can't have that same information. Like I don't lose out by giving, you know, a bit of code to you as well, and, you know, really kind of form the basis of a lot of the way that open source runs too. And what's interesting to me is how that space shifted through Bitcoin and through the possibility of now having scarcity in the digital space towards a very different approach, which, you know, so now you have like people in this space that are very kind of concerned with developing a very secure kind of property rights regimes in the digital space, where, you know, that same culture was about the absolute reverse before. So you've had this kind of funny shift in some ways when, you know, through the fact that blockchain now makes digital scarcity a possibility. And I think that's another kind of cryptoeconomic frontier, let's say, that would be really interesting and that I'm kind of trying to work through at the moment, of, you know, what is appropriate scarcity in the digital space? What kind of economics does the digital space as an economic space allow for, that is different than the physical world? And can we kind of can we look in more detail at what should remain abundant, what should be made scarce, and also the relationship between the digital and the physical in these systems and how they're configured in these systems, if that makes sense. Yeah.
All right, well, I've got to run. Thanks a lot, Jaya. We'll see you next week.
Thanks. Bruce, can you hold on for 2 seconds just before
Sure.
you go? Maybe I'll just do a quick like how we're planning to run the seminars. Because I think what we're going to try and do is get a couple people to commit to sets of the readings beforehand, and a couple people to commit to respond to those readings. Just so you know the kind of structure of the seminars. But I mean, you obviously don't have to do that this time around. But just to let you know how we're going to be running things. Yep. All right. Ciao. But yeah, so that's the idea basically, is a couple, so as a way to kind of like open the discussion a little bit. So each week, some of you will commit to reading the things, and then some others will commit to respond to those who have read. So you'll read and then present, let's say, in the seminar, and then someone else will respond to that. Patrick, is that something that you organize logistically, or is that something that we agree on, like?
Normally, we agree on this in the end of this of a session.
Yeah. Okay.
And I mean, if we are over time and all that, we can also do it in email, but it's always better to do it in the last half hour of the seminar.
Sure.
Or at the start of the seminar, let's say the first 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But it's your call. You just say how we going to do it, and I'll say okay.
Cool. So maybe just like I'll ask you guys some questions. You know, because I am interested in how this particular approach to the protocols and to the field sits for you. You know, is this how you know, what is this something that you've kind of let's say, is this an obvious angle to you? Is this a very new way of approaching blockchain? Is this how you'd understand the question of politics in relation to blockchain or to cryptoeconomics? How is it working out so far?
So specifically, are you talking about the generalizing technical fixes to social problems?
Yeah.
Okay. I have to think on that.
Maybe.
Oh yeah. So if I may answer, can you hear me? Oh,
yes. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, no, it is not an obvious angle, but it's something that I definitely thought of, especially thinking about the our technocracy. It's a sort of propaganda. So like math and statistics have been used as a propaganda tool for neoliberalism, for example, with the free markets theory. And so, yeah, this sort of reminds me of something that is not labeled as political, and people in the blockchain community don't want to sort of read this technology in a political way, but it is. And yeah, this has to be addressed. So yeah, I very much agree with your approach. And yeah, I'm not sure how, like, if this is going to be addressed in a sort of traditional way, or if probably we have to come up with new ideas and new political ideas as well that can sort of reflect the properties of this technology. So it's going to be interesting.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I've been, you know, working through, when I started looking more carefully at the concept of trustlessness, you know, it was one of these like very kind of mind-bending situations where I was like, okay, but how is, you know, but you know, trustlessness, but it's true for the technical system, right? Like it's the you know, they're modeling things like there's a truth to the trustlessness element, but then when you look at it from a kind of let's say a user's perspective, there's nothing trustless about these systems at all. You're trusting a lot of people. You're trusting a lot of people's statements. This is why there's so many scams that happen in between the kind of the user and then the actual protocol. You can say as a developer that this is a trustless protocol. I can choose to trust and believe what the developer is saying, or the community of developers and so on. But that kind of relationship between the social and the technical, where something can be true, in a kind of technical model and in a way that will make something like work, and yet still somehow be fuzzy, untrue, partially true, play out in unexpected ways and so on, within a kind of political, economic, or social context, is a kind of, that dynamic, I think, is quite a complex dynamic.
Yeah, sure.
So, can I ask something?
Yeah.
So the blockchain is a kind of Rousseauian social contract, but it's an anonymous social contract, as we don't know who the other contract givers and contract holders are.
Yeah, something like this. But it's a bit of a kind of, it's a shift in the, let's say, it's a translation into a new language also. It's a translation also into a technical language, translating a political problem into a technical language, which is in itself a political proposition, that, we can create, well, it is in itself a, let's say, it's almost a metaphysical approach, actually, that there is this thing that is external to us, and it is a certain set of mathematical and technical principles, and those principles we can base everything else on, because we can be certain that they're outside of our own kind of like messy opinions and so on. And this is like this is really kind of at the core of, I noticed how strong this particular tendency was when reading through some of the kind of developers mailing lists in Bitcoin. And there was one person that said something along the lines of that, unfortunately, Bitcoin was built on a substrate of mushy humans, but it's a pure system built on mushy humans. But that kind of like understanding of that you have, the pure system is somehow kind of set first, and is so easily divorced from the world, I think points to a very particular understanding of a schism between the objective and the subjective. And this is something that we're going to go into quite a bit in the next session. But yeah, a kind of a social contract that is with a let's say mathematical metaphysical principle.
Thanks.
So you mentioned that like the protocol is sort of agnostic to the data when it comes to like Ethereum, but isn't that what makes it trustless, because the third party or the intermediary or the protocol itself isn't making any? That's what makes it a trusted system, as opposed to like where you might have Google, which prefers some kind of data over other kinds of data, so might privilege certain kinds of it over. Yeah. So I guess I'm just curious. So what's like the impact of, what was the reason you were talking about that it's agnostic to the data? Is that a bad thing in some ways? Or is there a sense in which that's like a potentially a negative thing?
That's a really good question. And good to clarify a bit, because yes, that is exactly what makes it trustless, and that's exactly the point, and that's exactly what it should be doing as a decentralized system, and that is exactly what makes it potentially, such a powerful architecture to to avoid things like the current kind of centralized internet. But the reason why I was highlighting it, the reason why I was talking about it being agnostic is exactly to address this, like what happens when you start generalizing that idea onto a kind of social and political space, right? So it's like it's doing what it should do technically for a very specific purpose that we want that technology to serve, but conflating that form of consensus, that very, very specific form of consensus that, yes, is agnostic to the data, to a kind of other, let's say a question of social and political consensus, that's when it gets really problematic, because you don't want a social and political consensus to be agnostic to the data. Like you don't, you know, this is the kind of space where the data actually matters massively. You know, what's true or not matters politically and socially. So if that helps, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. It seems like that might be a sort of like core polarity potentially, like creating a left and right within, maybe replacing the current left and right potentially as some kind of like a polarity within the space. I could see that causing a lot of disagreement.
Yeah.
Potentially, whether or not that it could or should be agnostic in that sense.
Like, you mean in the sense of like whose side are you on? The pure systems, you know, core, or the mushy humans?
Yeah. Like, should it be applied all the way down and all the way up, or should the agnostic system be applied all the way down, or is there a point at which we need to have something that has some ethic?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is very much like the, you know, I think there does seem to be more and more discussion of this in the space around, you know, trying to define what is the actual design space. So what is or is not possible to design in terms of behavior and so on through the protocol, and what should be taken care of through other mechanisms. But there's also other elements to the, you know, because I think that the danger here is looking at the protocol and assuming that it can be applied, you know, through the whole kind of like stack, when actually like I think the blockchain space woke up to the fact that you know, that kind of infinite regression of these mechanisms, you know, at some point someone's writing the protocol, right? And at some point the governance of the writing of the protocol also matters, which functions in quite different ways, you know. So you have, you know, I think the Bitcoin scaling conflict has done a lot to show how, you know, one thing is kind of consensus in the protocol design. Another thing is, you know, consensus in the actual coding of the protocol itself, and also the kind of different kind of hacks and exploits that have happened since in the space have shown a lot about the limits to computational consensus in relation to social consensus, let's say.
Actually, Jaya, can you just clarify why it's important that data is not agnostic in political and social consensus, just so I can understand that distinction more clearly, if you're pitting those two things against each other, or contrasting those two things?
Yeah, so let me try and think of a good example. So from the perspective of the protocol, wait, let me try and think of one of the kind of like, so if we take the good example is always the you know, there's the DAO hack that happened in the Ethereum space, right? So from the perspective of the protocol, you know, the fact that there was this person that exploited a particular aspect of the smart contract that defined the DAO in, do you know, understand the decentralized autonomous organizations? Yeah, so in Ethereum, there was a big hack on the first kind of like attempt at creating a decentralized autonomous organization. From the perspective of the code and the protocol itself, it was absolutely, you know, it was possible for this to happen. It was possible for the 265 Ether every kind of loop to be subtracted from the account, and to, you know, $60 million disappeared that way. From the perspective of the protocol, it was possible for that to happen, and it did happen, and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing good or bad about that. It doesn't matter. It's agnostic. It doesn't actually care, right? It just processes, like the network processes the transactions, the network processes the computation. That's what it does. But then you know, you have the community being like, well, we don't want to lose our money, and so then the community goes in and decides that, or some part of the community decides that that hack should never have happened. Let's revert to a different stage in the blockchain. But so, like, in this space, it's like, you know, basically it's the difference between knowing that something is bad and harmful and knowing that it's not, or yeah. I mean, I guess that's the kind of most simple way to put it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah. I guess it's a little bit, it points exactly to the problem of the idea that you can kind of find a pure space, a kind of clean starting point from which, you know, all kind of, from which there's, I guess, like, it problematizes the question that the idea that you can have a kind of neutral layer that will always remain neutral, right? Because the execution of that layer happens within a non-neutral environment. It happens in the real world where things just aren't neutral. And so therefore, and also things are never fixed, meaning like we never get to a point where we know forever after what is good and bad in this world, what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. I mean, these are social norms. These are kind of also political tendencies and battles and struggles that play out, and culture changes and so on. So the protocol will never be final, and it will never be neutral, exactly because it's enacting things in the real world. So it's a difficult question because it poses a bit of a limit to it poses the question of what is the limit to the design space of trustlessness. What is the limit to the design space of what should and can be trustless? And yeah, I think those are very big discussions in this space.
I would like to ask another question. Is it possible to think of the Bitcoin protocol and cryptocurrencies as something other than encrypted way of communicating with each other? I mean, because I see it like a social game, like there's a certain set of rules that people, although the protocol is not built on these rules, because you can cheat against these rules and you can get money out of it. It's first, I see it first as a way of communication, and second, there is filter, this social contract built so people cannot use the full capacity of the protocol. Or is it I'm just seeing this from a wrong
What do you mean by can't use the full capacity of the protocol? Exactly.
Because if you are able to basically, it's not a hack if it's possible to do it. It's only a hack if you change data on the server, if you basically go beyond the protocol, you attack the data that is created by the protocol, then I see it as a hack. Then it's something that is beyond the protocol. But once you are able to get the protocol to do something that the social contract or the creators have never envisioned, the filter, which is the social contract, goes in and says, we never wanted it to go there. Now we're cutting it off. We're basically hindering the usage of full possibility that this protocol gives you.
Yep. Yeah, I mean that is the constant, that's the constant game, right? It's a little bit the, let's say, the main work that you see happen in security research and in the development of new protocols is exactly to model as many attacks as possible, try and understand how people might game the protocol. And it's I think it's like it's an exercise and it's a process that people in the space take a lot of pleasure from. Like it is really a game of finding new ways of exploiting these systems, and it is let's say the InfoSec community. It's something that goes a little bit beyond a game also, because that deals more with the security elements and it can get quite dark. But to me, it also points a little bit to the difference in the interest, let's say, of people that have that kind of mentality, and then maybe a broader set of users, where playing such games is not like the priority number one. And so, you get a bit this like race to create these trustless systems, and this race to constantly create, more and more secure protocols that is only getting more complex, exactly because I think so. One thing that I was going to talk about that in the presentation that I think I skipped over a bit was the way that when these economic dynamics are incorporated into network security in the way that they are in blockchain protocols, it's not just that like we potentially are changing the way that economics operates or politics or law and so on to deploy these technologies. It also goes deep into computation. If you're suddenly running computation based on a system that's secured through through designing economic behaviors, you're also opening up, let's say, the security of the protocol to a vast new set of dynamics that are quite unusual. I mean, that go beyond the normal kind of like hacking, let's say. I mean, because it's also things like calculating the profitability of mining in relation to the cost of new hardware in relation to, and then quantum. I mean, you have kind of a whole set of economic dynamics, and not just the kind of hardware and mining. I mean, that's a kind of bit of a banal example, but also things like exchange rates, right? That like the exchange rate to the dollar matters. The exchange rate between Bitcoin and the dollar all of a sudden potentially might matter for the security of the whole network. I mean, you're really opening up the attack surface also in terms of the kind of game theory stuff that you're talking about to a whole load of new dynamics. Because you're bringing economics, you're bringing financial tendencies and all kinds of things deep into the way that computation operates in the decentralized network, the security model for decentralized computation. And I think that's something that's like quite fascinating, how incorporating these whole new fields might change the nature of how computation works and how thinkers in that space operate. not just on the flip side, not just how blockchain is going to affect politics and economics, but how politics and economics is going to change computation. I mean, the incorporation of these dynamics into that space will change computation.
I have more of a kind of question comment here. I noticed that some people in the group have been using the term social contract and protocol almost interchangeably. And I'm wondering, could you speak more on that? I know there's like, trying to remember, someone wrote the book Protocol, which I haven't read, but yeah, it kind of goes into that more. Could you speak to that?
Do you mean the book by Alexander Galloway, Protocol?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I guess, so one thing that book discusses quite a bit is this question of the difference between code language and regular language, and how that inspires a certain kind of way of thinking about law differently when when you're thinking in terms of code. So the idea is a little bit, and this is something that I would like to unpack also in the next session a bit, is that human languages are vague, and you can say one thing and do something else. So there's a bit of a kind of gap, a distance between what is like represented through the language and the actual thing that then happens, or the thing that you're referring to. So I can say, a bottle of water, but me saying bottle of water is not the same as the bottle of water. Whereas with code languages execute, and they execute immediately. They execute as they're written, and that also makes the whole kind of idea of smart contracts, let's say, or the idea of code as law, look like something that's much more certain and much more determined than how we would normally understand the legal system as it operates through human-based languages, let's say. Of course, like the exploit and other kinds of situations have shown the problems that might arise from that like sometimes it's good that we are able to correct and say, actually, I might have said this and you might have understood this to mean that, but there's a certain kind of fuzziness where the intent matters in the traditional legal system. Whereas, when you operate in a situation where code is law, it literally does what it says regardless of what you intended. So with the DAO, for example, that was problematic because the intention was not for the DAO to lose $60 million, and yet it did happen because there was a flaw in the code, and there is always going to be some mistakes in coding these architectures. So the certainty is to some extent promised and it's imagined, but there's always problems when it then plays out in reality, and there's reasons for why being able to say, actually I meant this, can be a good thing. But so there was something else I wanted to say about the Galloway book, specifically. So I mean, the book is really the other element that's quite useful to think through conceptually. He talks about it. There's quite a lot of theorists in this space of what's called science and technology studies, is a kind of particular form of power, let's say, that operates through protocols, but also through technology, through devices, even through the way that landscapes are shaped and so on. So this is just a kind of a tool in order to understand different types of power dynamics, right? So with the way that Alexander Galloway talks about it, which is as a protocological power, is this thing of exactly you create a kind of scenario, a protocol or a technical device or whatever else that does something in a particular way, and that shapes the landscape in a particular way that makes it kind of more or less desirable for you to then do something specific. So in the Bitcoin scenario, it would be like the mining reward, right? You're kind of you've designed a protocol in such a way that you encourage people to behave in one way rather than another. And that's a very different form of power than a disciplinary power that punishes people afterwards. So the example that Galloway uses that might be a bit easier to understand is speed bumps. So speed bumps would be a kind of protocological power. You've kind of shaped the road in such a way that it's more desirable for the driver to slow down. And so the driver will slow down, but the driver won't necessarily, I mean, in the case of speed bumps, maybe yes, but won't necessarily, look at it as a kind of explicit form of restriction on them. It's just, I will automatically slow down because there's a bump, right? Whereas when you have a kind of a sign with a speed limit, that is a kind of different form of power. That's a disciplinary power. You get punished after the case. And it operates in quite different ways, let's say. So that's quite an interesting way of understanding how power dynamics can be something that can be delegated and encoded into a protocol, encoded into a landscape, or encoded into a kind of set of devices that just kind of silently operate and silently enforce a certain set of possible actions within a space. A certain set of possible actions that some people are able to perform in a given space. And so the design of that space, the design of the protocol, the design of the kind of limitations of what's possible or impossible for who in any given moment becomes quite a kind of like powerful and interesting tool to shape a scenario towards one type of outcome or another. Is that a good answer for you, David?
Yeah, thank you. It just makes me think of the David Columbia. I think maybe this might be reading a couple weeks ahead, but yeah. David Columbia's paper on Bitcoin as far-right ideology.
Yeah.
Code as far-right ideology. And you mentioned earlier about Bitcoin being an Austrian economic system kind of thing. Then you also sort of said that's not, you don't see it as being limited to that, or I don't know if you're talking about crypto economics in general, but that really made me interested because I've been looking for something that's outside of the like Hayekian neoliberal paradigm that seems so common in the not even Hayekian, like very laissez-faire paradigm that seems to rule.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so I guess the main thing that I wanted to say was I think Columbia is a bit unfair in his kind of political judgment. Like I can see how there's certain people that are into right-wing political economy in the US, are pushing crypto in specific directions, but I don't think it captures neither the possibilities of the space nor in fact the kind of politics of a lot of people that are involved and have been involved from very early on. There are some elements of the kind of economic theory that is encoded into the Bitcoin protocol. The stuff Columbia talks a lot about this, the kind of critique central bank conspiracy theories and stuff, critiques of central bank issuing of money. That, is, I think, important to unpack. And I do agree that there's a bit of a lack of kind of more rigorous economic critique and reading in this space. But the interests are slightly different, and I hope, like in the presentation I was speaking about this stuff earlier, that kind of became clear that the concern is much more in designing decentralized systems that are censorship resilient in different ways, and also this idea of creating kind of systems that are able to pay for themselves, that are able to kind of sustain a community, is also an important part of it. I would also say though that I think there are also reasons for why Austrian school economics overlaps or is attractive to a lot of developers in this space, and it is very attractive, and you do get a lot of kind of rehashing of kind of a bit stereotypical economic kind of taglines from that school and just basic kind of Smith laissez-faire stuff. But this idea of like having a the kind of the market and the price system as a kind of decentralized communication system, because that's basically what Hayek was describing with the price mechanisms, I think just overlaps quite neatly with the systems thinking in this space. And that's why there's a lot of attraction there. But a lot of the same mistakes happen also. So a lot of the problems with Hayek's original market model replicate themselves in the kind of information model of the decentralized network systems that we're talking about in blockchain. So, and especially this kind of issue of, first of all, the conflation of the model with reality, that the model can look clean and neat and so on, but actually like what's important is less, less looking at this kind of like diagram that looks neat and pretty, and much more about how that diagram interfaces with other economic systems, other kind of models, and also how it interfaces and how it gets deployed in reality, right? And what I mean by that is, like, for example, okay, so great, the Bitcoin protocol, the potential for a system that pays for itself, we're now issuing our own money and so on, and the community is kind of patting its back, being like, great, we've made a lot of money, we've designed something amazing, but then you look at kind of the actual economic space in the community, and it's not full of Bitcoin, it's full of dollars, it's full of euros, it's full of yen. What I mean by that is that the wealth of a community is mediated through the exchange rates, right? And so what you have here, I guess what I'm saying is, like, I want to put at the center of the questions, the kind of edges, the interfaces really between the different economies, and those interfaces are not going to go away. There's never going to be a situation where all of a sudden all other forms of economic activity have been subsumed into only the Bitcoin model. So that's one issue, and then that's like, let's say, a horizontal issue. So you've got one system, and it interfaces with lots of other systems, lots of other economic modes of production, lots of other currencies, lots of other modes of economic reproduction, so on and so forth. So that's the kind of horizontal complication. We don't just have one model. And then you have a vertical complication, let's say, which is the fact that not only, there is never only the protocol, so people can pick up but I guess what I'm saying is, like, in the critique of Hayek, it would be something like price fixing, right? It's like, not all communication happens through the market. People can pick up their phones and collude between them over the phone, right? Like, you have these other mediums of communication. You have these other kinds of ways in which power, politics, information, resources is organized, and it doesn't all go through the Bitcoin protocol. It doesn't all go through the price system, and that causes complications for an otherwise perfectly looking model, and it causes what is it called in market terms, market failures and so on. So yeah, there is an attraction to Austrian school economics for, I think, mostly like diagram reasons, as in, like, the models like overlap in many ways, and a lot of the assumptions overlap in many ways, which also means that a lot of the critiques really apply across both spaces. But again, I would say, like, the loyalty is not, I don't think it's like that much. I mean, not necessarily anyway, there's lots of space for experimentation with other forms of economics, and also lots of space for looking into exactly these dynamics of, what matters. And this is also what annoyed me a bit about the Columbia book, is that it's like, what matters is the effects, the interfaces, exactly the interfaces, rather than one final prognosis about, Bitcoin is right wing, or, but really look at how is Bitcoin potentially strategically deployed in different kind of situations and different circumstances? How is the abstract model of a profit-driven rational economic agent, how is that abstract model operationalized for a very specific purpose, instead of kind of being assumed as that, that's how people are in general, is that, no, but we can assume that in the very specific purpose of this specific protocol right here, it works okay, but that doesn't mean that what's necessarily going to spring from that is some kind of totalitarian right-wing economic regime. But to speak more on the kind of economics that Columbia is talking about, I think there's some really important stuff there about the specific kind of idea around money creation that floats around on the right wing. That central banks simply print money, and that's a way of kind of like stealing from the average person and so on. The money creation doesn't happen that way. And there's, after the financial crisis, the big critiques of the money creation mechanisms were exactly about the fact that money creation now happens through debt, and it happens largely, by private banks, not by central banks, and it happens by private banks, and is kind of regulated through adjusting interest rates, really. So, yeah, so I think Columbia does important work in bringing out, really excavating the provenance of some of the ideas that are floating around, why, the reasons for why, or the relationship between Bitcoin and gold and this kind of stuff, that I think he's quite good at critiquing for very important reasons. But it's an unfair judgment to conflate the entire space with right-wing extremism or right-wing extreme economic ideas. There's lots more space than that, and lots more going on than that.
I mean, there's one thing I just would like to add. I know of a group of leftist economics in Austria who actually talked on a theoretical level about implementing Bitcoin-ish a model for reducing the non-work that people who live in Austria that have no work, how that could be reduced by implementing a coinage, a digital coinage that can only be used for certain products. And the economy would have worked like this, like it's an experimental model, that you're unemployed, and then you go to the office where you can say, I can do, let's say, ice cream. And they will say, oh, okay, we have like 15 other people who can do all the other stuff that you have to do in order to make ice cream. And we'll just present it to them, and they're all unemployed, just like you. Will give you facilities, and all those products can only be paid with this coinage. This, let's say, call it unemployment coin or whatever, and therefore you put in, give people opportunity, and then they can only use it in their circles. Like, it's not possible to buy this anywhere else. So, I mean, it's a completely experimental model. It's not something that I find especially viable, but it's a leftist model. And it was developed by leftists, and I just wanted to present it here because I know these people well, and they're all not right-wing.
Yeah.
So as an factical opposition to the claim that Bitcoin models always come up with these evil right-wing people, and then something happens.
Yeah. Yeah, I think your example points to another really kind of interesting tendency, because one thing that I've been trying to think through, because I had there were some people that I knew that were slightly involved in a proposal here in the UK, in Hull for a period of time, where the idea was kind of similar, as in creating a coin for paying people to do bits and pieces of work for the kind of social good in the community, so people that otherwise are in benefits and so on. And then they could get paid in this coin, and then they could use that to pay for their utilities, and to get, various products in specific supermarkets and stuff like that. And, on the one hand, it sounded good, as in it was a way to pay people from public money, but without spending public money, so you have a local council that has had a lot of their budget cut by the central government following the financial crisis. Yeah. So they have had their budget cut, and they're trying to work out ways to manage with less budget and deal with the high unemployment in the area. And so you just create, let's just create our own money. We can create our own kind of Bitcoin system. We can pay people for doing work in the community and so on. But when I heard that model, there was a really kind of dark flip side to that, which is basically, the benefit of cash is that it's there's a certain freedom to it. People can spend it on whatever they want. Yeah. And so when you pay people in cash, you're giving them a piece of freedom to do whatever they want with that cash. And in this case, all of a sudden you had a situation where, unemployed people were going to get special unemployed money that you can only use for very specific types of products and so on. And actually, to me, it looks much less of a kind of project that would be beneficial to the poor and the unemployed, and look more like a kind of form of social control, where it's like, you need to do something that's good for the community, and whatever is good for the community is something that who knows who is going to decide. And then you get paid with this special money, which and that you can only use to pay for your utilities and for very specific products from specific supermarkets. So it became this really quite a dark form of social control. And it also made me think about how, this idea of creating a trustless system, which was the original idea of Bitcoin, where, someone like WikiLeaks or whatever could not be boycotted, or you cannot have the US government control their donations, because there's a system that is neutral to the politics, is neutral to what you want to spend it on, and so on and so forth, in that sense. And then all of a sudden, because you have created programmable money, you can also do the opposite. You can also create money that, where everything is super fine grained, and you can only spend, on specific types of products and specific types of areas, colored coins, all this kind of stuff. There's lots of different, and this isn't a value judgment, by the way. It's an interesting kind of observation, let's say, and there's good and bad things and lots of these different kind of ways of applying things. But I just noticed how all of a sudden how fine-grained the economic space could become, in terms of what can be spent where, by who, when, in terms of, all the different forms of money. You'll have so just the kind of more and more coins, more and more tokens representing different types of communities, different types of spending habits, different types of economic models, and more fine-grained governance of, if we look at kind of other blockchain, not just the currency side, but more and more fine-grained property rights potential, property rights management potential too. So this fine-grained tweaking of, who can do what in which situations, there's some potential dark side to that. where obviously the intention, and I'm sure also the intention from your friends from the left in Austria, is to create more economic space for people that currently don't have access to money. But in actual fact, it might also have the opposite effect, that instead of like organizing a movement to increase cash payouts to unemployed people, it becomes a kind of movement to re-employ unemployed people under, you know, unpaid or like very kind of like weirdly paid conditions, let's say. So conditions where you're paid with a specific kind of money that makes you less free in terms of your spending habits than anyone else. Are people tired? Is that I feel like the concentration might be a little bit like I'm feeling a little bit maybe because I'm speaking a lot, maybe that's why I'm feeling a little bit tired, but is everyone still awake, interested, and so on?
Maybe you have do you have another set of slides?
Not for today, no. You want me to do another presentation? I usually limit the amount of talks that I do to one a day.
Okay. I've been reading a little bit of using blockchain in non-digital ways, like in social interactions that are not that is not coin-based, like Mohammed Salemi used once said that potluck is like a very early version of the protocol, as in that there is a sharing community where you don't know who gave you what, but you still know that because this person was invited to your potluck, you have to re-invite the person next time, and this person has to re-invite you there. You never know who gave you, let's say, the little cake and who gave you the golden lampshade.
Mm-hmm.
If we have the time, anyway, just maybe I wanted to go back and talk about the like abundance versus scarcity, point, which I think is, yeah, I like the way that you articulated that early peer-to-peer communities like challenge this idea of scarcity, and yeah, I think it's interesting the way that blockchain brings back some of those things, and I wondered whether there are ways that people are thinking about scarcity in blockchain communities that still feel ideologically aligned with like earlier peer-to-peer challenges of scarcity, if that makes sense. Like, or do you think it's a fracture?
I think it's multi-layered. So, you know, because it is a fiercely open source community. So in that sense, like there are some elements of, you know, knowledge is still something that is, you know, considered to be in abundance and should be abundant and should be freely available and so on. Code should be freely available. It's kind of slightly reconfigured from being a political and economic question of scarcity and abundance. It's a bit more in the blockchain space of a kind of a security question, that you need to have open source code because otherwise you don't know how it's built, and that could potentially be a security risk, right? It could be badly built. But there is also a bit the ethos of abundance on that front. Otherwise, like, I mean, there are projects, let's say, that look at other forms of economic models that, so I think like, I mean, Holochain isn't strictly a blockchain project, but uses hash trees. And I think they have, these ideas of thinking about currencies as flows rather than, fixed property. So instead of thinking about how much coin you have in a wallet, it's more about like where flows of value are going to in any given moment in time and whether they're going to the right places. I still need to look into the protocol a bit more to understand how that's codified exactly. And then, but I also think that there's interesting ways that scarcity and abundance can be like employed in the digital space. So if you are going to have a digital representation of an otherwise scarce physical asset, for example, it might make sense that you're able to impose that kind of scarcity in the kind of economic modeling at that point. But otherwise, yeah, I think it's some open questions that I still don't have the answers to in terms of like what should or should not be represented as abundant or scarce, or treated as abundant or scarce. And also because obviously, like, the interesting thing about both of these concepts is that they're quite deeply political and economic, because also you have, in terms of physical resources, you'll see a lot of let's say what is it, scarcity by design, rather than necessarily just to do with the fact that there wasn't enough of the physical things there. It's more like you have scarcity by design in order to manipulate markets in different ways. Yeah. It's a bit of a roundabout answer.
Yeah, no, it wasn't a very clear question anyway. But yeah, I'm just interested in thinking about that, especially because I think I like that from what I know of your work, that you're thinking about like about you talk a lot about the communities that have, and how they've kind of evolved, like how peer-to-peer communities have evolved into kind of blockchain communities, or where those ideas are rooted in. And so to me, I just find that very interesting. There's a tension, because for so long challenging scarcity models was just so central to peer-to-peer communities. So to see it come back is kind of strange, I think. But yeah, it
is really strange. And I mean, I remember when I first noticed it too, I was like, this is weird that we suddenly, and I don't think it's not only about property, it's not only about scarcity. It's also about reproducing pretty much all the technologies of the state. Yeah. As in, like, you find the blockchain space being really concerned with how are we going to secure and identify, how do we have like the correct identity systems, and how do we have the correct kind of voting systems? How do we have the correct, so it's like all the kind of like traditional technologies of the state, including identity, money, and you name it, and policing as well, in a sense, get reproduced in this space, but in a really kind of funny, like quite radically different manner, but with the same sets of concerns. So it's almost like let's do the state's job better, and there's a little bit of a lack of critique of these technologies and what other possibilities there might be, that like, okay, maybe defining property, through the traditional lens of property rights is just not that interesting. I mean, can we do it differently? Can we think about things differently? Instead of, private property and, let's create a unique identifier for, like, I think it's not an accident that, it's not an accident that the first smart contract project attempted to build a smart lock, right? Like this kind of relationship between the locks and the physical space and the digital space, and making all these correspond in that sense is, I think, symptomatic. So the way that, just to give a bit of a kind of overview of the next few weeks, I thought I would, I thought kind of to go back to the kind of grounding in order to ask the question of how can we understand a technology like this that claims to solve the problem of politics by removing it and putting it into a technical realm and reconfiguring it as a technical problem and solving it as a technical problem, is to look a little bit at first the question of technology and how to understand technology politically. So some of the difficult questions around that, and the readings in the next week are going to be about that. After that, a little bit about how to understand economics politically. So a kind of basic political economy in a sense, but more in the context of cryptoeconomics. That's kind of the next 2 weeks, just to give a bit of a preview on that. And so for next week, I've kind of divided the readings up into 2 sets, because they're quite dense readings with a lot of things that could be discussed. So the first set is concerned with, the question of, one strategy that people have been using to try and understand the relationship between the technical and political is to open up the black box, right? So it's like, let's open up the algorithms, let's look closer at the protocols, so that then we can finally understand their implications, what they're telling us, what they're presenting to us, what political reality they're going to bring forward, and so on. But there are some complications with that, and that is that we're not just dealing with singular protocols, we're dealing with whole systems. And a lot of the times we're dealing with systems and algorithms that have effects that are emergent, meaning even the way the algorithms are designed respond to a given environment in different ways and in emergent ways. So what does that do to how we can know technology politically, how we can know the algorithm? So that's the first set of readings, is a little bit concerned with those questions. And I've given 3 readings for that. So there's a text by Louisa Moore called Cloud Geographies. Then there's a kind of introduction, I guess, to Benjamin Bratton's stack through his text, The Black Stack, so kind of short essay piece by him. And then an interview with Catherine Hales, How We Became Posthuman. So I don't know if there's anyone that wants to commit to doing those readings and giving a brief presentation in the next seminar. Is there anyone that would be up for that?
I'll do it.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
Nice
sure.
one. Cool. And is there anyone that could commit to responding to Chiara on
I'm
her
happy to
presentation?
respond.
Nice one. Great.
Because I'm sure I'll have a lot of questions.
Great. And then the second set of readings is a bit more on the kind of I guess a more general question of how does the technical exist in the world. So some ways that theorists have addressed this question is looking at the historical contingencies, so looking at specific historical moments when a given technology like the bicycle or internet protocols or other things might have gone in one direction or another, and the reasons for why one or the other was chosen, which are and the kind of, let's say, the social, political, economic, cultural context and debates that happen around that time, to show how technology doesn't just emerge and develop on its own kind of tangent and through its own logics, but is also shaped by the kind of embedded realities that it's part of. And there are some kind of more complicated questions around that of how does that then account for the fact that some things in the lab just work and others don't, that some kind of protocol, some architectures will work while others don't, and so on. So those are the questions of the second set. So a little bit this kind of more, how do we approach, how do we situate technology in society in a way that makes sense theoretically. And so again, 3 readings, Karen Barad, which is quite dense, and someone was talking about onto epistemologies earlier. Brian might have read some Barad. And then another reading by Paul Edwards, a very interesting and very kind of clear introduction to infrastructures and what infrastructures do in society. And then a fantastic text by Philip Rogaway called The Moral Character of Cryptographic Work, which is a bit of like a wake-up call to the cryptographic community to address the work that they do as part of shaping political and social realities of people in really important ways, and the kind of the ethical responsibility that comes with that, and the way he frames things is very interesting and quite nice. So is there anyone that could commit to doing those readings in a brief presentation on that?
I'll do that.
Nice one, Brian. And anyone that feels like responding to Brian? Anyone that would like to respond to Brian's presentation? Right, we'll do a mail out, and if not, then I'll be very happy to respond.
I could also ask everybody separately. I could start with Alan. Do you want to respond? Alan?
Yes, okay, I can respond. But how does the response work? I mean, he presents and then we say what we think about what he said.
Yeah, well, so it will be probably easier for you if you also have readings. I guess it's more like ask questions or things that you found might have contradicted or verified, or your understanding might be slightly different or so on, but like a kind of response where you bring up some questions about how they just presented the material.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah.
Right.
Or just things you're curious about that, in their presentation. Nice one. So I think we might keep it at that for this first session, if that's okay with everybody, unless there's any last questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
While it's not completely possible to forge bitcoins, you can double spend if you have a extremely fast computer, which in a way forging while selling. It's like this old card trick where you put in a coin and it has a string attached and you pull it back. And that it's like you throw it into 5 machines at the same time, but you can only do it while you actively spend the money.
Yeah.
And I mean, I see Bitcoin more like as a gamified, as a D-game, it's a game from how I see it.
Yeah.
People are constantly trying to de-gamify it, to make it something that is completely concrete. I mean, just barely, for me, a game is something you can cheat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like in Monopoly, you can have some coins, some money under your sleeve, and if your grandma looks away, you put in a house and you say, no, I always had this model. Grandma, you can't remember. But while something concrete is something where you just cannot cheat, it's impossible to cheat. The one thing is the game, and another thing is, let's just call it concrete. And they're constantly trying to say, no, it's not a game. No, I am. You're not a game. You're not allowed to. And like this double spending thing, while technically it's not really viable to do it all the time, because you have to have a lot of energy power, you have a lot of strong computer. So at some point they will possibly find out, and then you have a negative social interaction with the rest of the Bitcoin community, and you have to start again and all that. But still, I'm very interested in this kind of possibility to forge while doing something.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's again, to think of Bitcoin a little bit less as like what a monolithic thing, and then understand it a little bit as it engages with different communities and different kinds of spaces. You know, for some people, you know, cryptocurrencies, it is absolutely a game, and they're playing that game. And there's a reason why game theory is, you know, one of the main ingredients in crypto economics, is because you are setting up a game, and you're setting up a game with a particular type of players that are looking to, you know, all kinds of different angles, both mathematically, computationally, economically, and so on, to maximize their profit. That's one kind of community engagement, involvement, right? Then you have another, which is the speculation, and kind of behaviors and you know, exchanges and so on, and that's a different kind of interaction. That's a slightly different kind of game, let's say. And then yes, you do have the people that try and kind of pull this into a real, you know, let's make some ATMs and some point of sale devices and some things where people are actually using this as money in the way that we normally understand money. And that works sometimes less so. And the same thing with smart contracts and so on, right? It's like, you know, you have everything from CryptoKitties to people that are trying to build kind of actual, you know, business management and so on using smart contracts. So it's different types of spaces and different types of engagements that like all matter for different versions of the story, let's say, depending on what it is that we're trying to tease out in our sets of questions.
In poker, you can bluff your way out of a tricky situation. You can say, I have this amount of cards, and you don't have them, but then you win because the other people just pull out. Is there a way to bluff in the Bitcoin protocol? Is there some way to bluff your way in or out of the blockchain?
Yeah, now I'm trying to think of, there was a specific attack that I was looking at for a bit.
Yeah, the 51% attack.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's 51% attack for sure. Exactly. There was also something about the timing. There's a different attack also about taking advantage of timing in terms of like which peers would see the broadcast transactions. Like the propagation timing, but I can't remember the details of that. I mean, there is kind of like analogies to bluffing for sure. You show something to some part of the network and show something else to another part of the network and bet against who's going to win out first and so on.
So the trickster uses the realm of the space-time continuum in the blockchain to get what he or she or it wants.
Yeah, the space-time continuum, but also just the fact that it's a network of peers, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would say something like forking what happened with Bitcoin Cash and then all the other Me Too's.
Yeah.
I feel like that's pretty close to what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So and there are constantly new attacks, or it's like there are uphill cycle for attacks. Like is it slowly diminishing, or are constantly new attacks being created in a even faster way. Or
Well, there are some classic attacks that are always kind of like tried to model for. So things like DDoS attacks, Sybil attacks, 51%, this kind of thing are the usual ones that any new protocol will try and look at and make sure that they're guarded against. But there is always new attacks being invented, and also some of them kind of like outside of the digital space, let's say. So, you know, when you start thinking about these projects in general from a security perspective, and how people can game not just the protocol, but also the kind of community in the space in general, you know, there's a lot of that happening.
Yeah, one of my security researcher friends has pointed out that Bitcoin is the largest bug bounty in the world right now. So billions of dollars if you're able to successfully hack Bitcoin. And what's happened is that the protocol layer, that's like battle tested, and then it's almost all of the insecurity is in the human stuff. So I don't know if you saw recently, there was someone who went and he brought a cell phone to this phone store. The clerk there looked at his phone, saw that he had tons of cryptocurrency, took out his SIM card and used that to steal, you know, to do the two-factor authentication, and ended up stealing millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And he actually did this happened to the same guy twice.
Yeah.
So there's all these other, you know, factors where someone else has pointed out that really the trust factor of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency is censorship resistance. So you cannot stop a payment from going through the system from one person to the other, but that's the extent of the trust. Everything else beyond that, right? It reverts back to you know, other standards. Yeah. So.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something that you're well, I feel like I'm seeing more and more in the InfoSec community, in the information security research community, is looking at the issues of security, not just in the systems and protocol layer, but actually in the interface with the user and user behavior, and how important that is for any kind of proper security modeling. But the funny thing is, like, that I wonder how that's going to start working out, though, like, especially in terms of the concept of trustlessness, that like how, you know, how secure can you make things from, like, in terms of like going the trustless route, right? And whether there's a different route that needs to be kind of, I guess, like other forms of security rather than like bulletproof cryptographic trustless security, but forms of security that operate maybe more on norms, more on habits, more on culture, this kind of stuff. I think, I think there's a lot of interesting things happening in.
Yeah, that reminds me of my friend Sam Atman, who's a Urbit developer, pointed out when I was at the Economic Space Agency, we had lots of discussions about cryptocurrency and trust.
Yeah.
And the idea of things being trustless, it has this like flip side where one of it is you don't have to trust people in the network, and the other one is you don't trust people in the network.
Yeah.
And so everything that goes on, you know, the fact that you're able to send this payment through the network without trusting anyone, you end up paying these fees. And so that fee is a trust tax.
Yeah.
Right. And then all these other things where they're talking about decentralization, and then, you know, without fiat, you know, central banking and bankers and things like that. But then, you know, you don't have insurance, you don't have, you know, all these different things that you get with the banking system get left out.
Yeah.
And then now it's up to the individual, the radical individual, to take care of every single thing, you know, whether it's having a cold wallet, then having a backup, and, you know, all these things. And it's very much like, oh, you got hacked. Well, you know, you should have, that's your, you know, that sucks.
Yeah,
Sucks
exactly. Yeah.
So I see from what you described, it's similar to like in the Middle Ages when I was a rich person and I left the city and I want to go to a far away city. and another person also left the city and robbed me and came to the other city with my money. And since the other city has no trust relationship to me or the other person, they take the wealth, newly acquired wealth of this other person at face value. It was always the wealth of this other person, and I can not lay claim to my now stolen money. Or if I sail ship from port of London and I want to go to, let's say, Africa, and the pirate robs me, and then I'm no longer the rich merchant, but the robber takes my coat, my money, and my ship, and presents himself there as the rich merchant, and I'm nobody anymore. Is that something you use to describe this trustlessness in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if what you're saying is a little bit the fact that if you had been in the same city, then people would have known you and they would have known that the money was yours. And so the trust is operating on a different basis. And
I'm just trying to get social interactions from a historical perspective that at least not while completely similar have that there is something in the human, in the history of interaction with each other, has like a history of, let's say, things that are interactions that have a certain kinship to this trustlessness of a protocol, that there is some semblance of things that we humans do. Like if I go to a drug dealer and I give him money and buying this drug is not proper, I can't go to the police and claim, I want to buy drugs, but the drug dealer just gave me earth instead of this drug. Help me. I'm just trying to spin my head around the let's say the history of social interaction that leads to a possibility that is Bitcoin.
Yeah.
That reminds me of what you talk about with the stolen property. Something I looked at a while ago, so excuse my lack of memory here. But there's the concept of conversion, which is taking stolen property, and then that becomes a problem for legal things, and then you have to return to the rightful owner. And there's a vast amount of Bitcoin that has come out of ransomware, and then also stolen from Mt. Gox. And so the fact that there's like this, it's tracking the payment system means that some transactions may be stolen property. Even trading on a supposedly legitimate exchange could still be the transfer of stolen property.
Yeah. Yeah, and it raises a whole lot of complicated questions around whether you want, so there was proposals for colored coins and whatever where you could trace somehow the provenance of the money, but that defeats the other idea of like fungibility and the fact that money should be, the point of having kind of digital cash is exactly the fact that it's censorship resistant also in terms of like what the money is used for, or this kind of sense. Yeah, maybe I'm just because I've been talking a lot, I'm getting very tired, but I don't know where people's energy are at and if we should call it a day for this time. And then next time I think the discussion will probably be a bit more kind of lively and open. We'll be hearing from several of you and your comments on the readings in a bit more detail. So I'm very much looking forward to that.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, that's been great.
Thank you.
Excited?
Does that sound good? Or are there any
Yeah.
last questions?
Oh, are there going to be any, or how are we going to be measured? Just by presentations, or are there going to be written assignments?
So yeah, so next session, I'll give a bit more detail about that, because right now I'm juggling between, like, one option would be that your presentations would be, you would kind of develop those and turn them into a kind of either a video piece of, like, you giving a kind of more full presentation of the readings and the questions that you found interesting within that, or a written essay piece on the topic. But I'm kind of hovering between going that way, or like have us select a protocol and do a kind of particular type of analysis on the kind of protocol stuff. So I will send an email actually before next session about that. So you'll have a bit more information about the assessment and also deadlines and stuff.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Great. Well, really nice to meet everyone. There's lots of really good people in the room. I'm very happy about that. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the next few sessions.
All right. See you later, everyone.
Great. Bye.
Uh,
See you.